So a study was performed on the security of different lock screen mechanisms on Androids. And they took a look at how hard it was to try and shoulder surf people's pins or lock screen patterns. You found something interesting about Android unlock screens. Like usually when we talk to people about securing their own personal devices, the very first thing we tell them to do is to put a lock code on the screen, right? So that people can't get into it. But it seems like not everyone is following best practices, and that's the research you found?
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much what this story is really going over. So, and we've done stories on things like this before about securing your cell phone and putting either a PIN or a passcode on it. But we know that people are just not good at creating either good pins, swipe patterns on their phones. They're not even good at creating good security questions and answers.
Sure.
So there's basically a study that came out by a research team at both the U.S. Naval Academy and the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, to try to prove out whether or not using a swipe pattern or a pin was easier for an attacker to, by shoulder surfing, get from you.
Okay.
Right? What the research shows, and I think it's probably pretty obvious, is that when they were shown pictures of people putting in patterns, it was much easier for somebody who was technically shoulder surfing to be able to recreate the pattern,
right,
as opposed to putting a pin in.
Right, and the other thing about the patterns is that once you've used one of those dots, you can't reuse it in that pattern. I think it doesn't let you. You're drawing.
That's a good question. I thought you could.
Okay.
But I don't know. I don't have an Android phone.
What do you know,
but
Mike? Do you use an Android phone? Do you remember?
I don't. But one of the key indicators they had was feedback trails. So as one of the features inside of the Android device, you can turn on a little feedback trail, so it leaves a little stream of light behind your finger, so you know where you've been. And the ability to, reverse engineer, if you will, that pattern was considerably higher for instances where the video had the feedback trails turned on.
Sure, that makes sense.
Right. That was one of the things that they also tested as well, where I guess you're able to turn off the actual visual nodes on your phone.
So you can move around it, but it doesn't show the line of where you've been.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So the results, again, maybe you probably predicted this, but 10% of the people that were studied, looking at somebody putting in a 6-digit PIN, were able to get it right.
Wow.
That percentage went up to 25% when they were able to see the video a second time. Now switch over to using a pattern. So when now they were seeing videos of somebody inputting a pattern. What they saw was 64% were able to recreate the pattern on the first try, the first look. And then it jumps up to 80% when they're able to see the video a second time.
So I guess the message is really, if you're worried about shoulder surfing, then a pin is much stronger than a pattern.
Correct.
So it may seem obvious to most people who are looking at this study that, yeah, if you're swiping a pattern in like this, or as opposed to putting in a pin, it seems like the pin would be the more secure method for several reasons.
There is a paper here. It's like a 15-page paper if you want to go into the the nitty-gritty details here. But it's clear that the human brain is able to discern patterns more than they are able to capture movement of just a like I said, when your finger is just tapping a pin on the phone.
I kind of wonder at what distance they were at, because I know that if I knew the number sequence, I feel like I would know that. I'd be able to memorize that fairly easily. If I had to just memorize points on a grid, maybe it'd be a little bit harder.
Right. And I don't know who the pool of participants were. Were they people who have any kind of security knowledge? Clearly, if you were there, you would be. I know you'd be studying that screen very intently, right? Yeah. And you'd probably be one of the 10%. But I think in general, I think that's what they were showing is just, hey, look, if you're just sitting at a cafe somewhere with your phone out and you did this, would somebody just sitting directly behind you or to the side of you be able to discern what your pattern or pin was?
One of the things that I keep coming back to with that pattern is that I remember we might have covered it on the show maybe years ago, but someone realized that, hey, if you're going to take your finger and you're going to wiggle it all over your screen, you're going to leave a bit of a film of skin oil.
Right.
So if someone gets a hold of that phone and takes a look at it and you haven't really used it since you've logged in, that smear is going to show the path. And you've got, I mean, if you can do it in one direction or the other, that's two tries.
Right?
Yeah, you pretty much got it at that point.
Yep.
So ever since I heard about that, I moved on to using a PIN because, I'm going to be poking at my screen all day long. The chances of me giving away my PIN through the points I've touched on my screen is I think it's a lot less.
Right, yeah.
It just goes to show that, you have that trade-off between security and convenience, right? With any kind of new authentication mechanism or approach, those need to be looked at over time to see what new exposures or shortcomings that particular kind of approach might have. It'll be interesting to see how as we've been doing a lot of fingerprint authentication for a few different versions of the iPhone now for some time, and now we're seeing the newer versions come out with image-based authentication. It'll be interesting to see what shortcomings those methods eventually reveal also, if any.
The big discovery there in the story was the percentages clearly show that using an unlock pattern was less secure. It was more memorable for anybody who was watching you input that pattern into your phone. So, Mike, looks like you were looking at a story this week talking about companies and how they underestimate the cost of going through, some sort of breach.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, as we continue to see, large-scale breaches make the headlines, it's inspired some research about what that really entails, what that really means to a company, and kind of what the perceptions are from a recovery perspective. And there was a group of researchers in the UK that went through and sampled several hundred enterprise organizations to see really what their perception was around the recovery time and cost of having a significant data breach. And what they found was that the majority of enterprises are really not fully accounting for the impact of a major breach. They found that half the firms that they talked to believed that they would be fully operational within 48 hours of a breach, and that only 2% believed that the effects of a breach would last longer than 10 days.
Wow.
That was really, really shocking to me when I saw that data point. I mean, if anything, we've seen these things play out through the media, for months and months. Even
minor breaches, the aftershocks of it can be felt for weeks and months. But some of the numbers were coming around like 48 hours, we should be fine, we should be done and through this, which to me is shocking.
You're not going to be able to bounce back from one of these major breaches in the 48 hours or even in 7 days or a couple of weeks. That just doesn't happen.
Then it got into some of the other things that organizations were or were not accounting for with regard to total recovery cost of having a breach. And they found that only less than a quarter of firms were actually including public relations and communications groups as part of their incident response plans or incident response drills. And as we've seen, communication with customers and the media and the public can be critical to a successful breach response.
Getting the information out to the public as quickly as you possibly can in a safe manner, right, is the best way to respond to one of these breaches. The public responds the best when the information is brought to them as quickly as possible.
Only half the firms that were polled considered lost customers as part of the potential breach cost, and only a third of them actually factored in the cost of the investigation itself. So these were some very, very interesting data points, especially since we've been seeing these things play out really since 2014, that you would think that the numbers would be better than this. And sadly, if these are the improved numbers, I cringe at thinking of what they were prior to the last few years.
Right.
Clearly, this is not a UK-centric problem.
Right. Yeah.
Sure. I wonder how many, because we're saying this number of companies hadn't learned certain lessons, let's put it that way. And I wonder how many of them actually haven't had a major public-facing breach, or at least haven't admitted to having that same kind of a breach. I tend to think that once you've faced one of these, you do tend to plan in advance because you realize exactly how painful it is to go through, in the midst of everything, trying to coordinate like PR and incident response and messaging within the company. There's all sorts of things that you learn quickly you have to do.
Companies that have not been through it, I would hope that at least you try to learn from the other companies that have been through it, because a lot of information, right, has come out about these other companies that have gone through it. So maybe not the minute details, right? I mean, some of that stuff is kept very under wraps, but a lot of the major pieces, like, hey, what went wrong? What should have been in place, right? You missed talking with your PR and they didn't announce the breach in time, which always causes a problem. So all those things are lessons that could be learned without you having to go through it yourself.
Sure.
So,
which is the best way to learn a lesson, right?
Especially a painful one, from somebody else. And it's really, with data that's come out under a recent Ponemon Group study showing that the average cost of a breach per record is approaching about $225 per record.
Per record.
Now, that does give a benchmark, but there's a lot of things that are lumped into that, right? So when you start talking to organizations about really what does that $225 per record entail, there could be a lot of these things wrapped up into that if they're using that as their benchmark. But at the individual organization level, it's a good idea to regularly review your response plans, make sure that you are including all of the organizations inside of your company that would be involved, legal, PR, your executives, and not just your technical people, and that when large breaches make the news, that you are using them as sort of a unfortunate case study that you're then able to go back and say, do we need to tweak anything?
There's a lot of information that has come out about these breaches and what went wrong, what was the initial vector that allowed the attacker to get in. Learn from those things and then try to build your security around protections around those types of things, right? So being prepared for these things is much better than trying to prepare after the fact.
So Matt, tell me about the cryptocurrency research that you were studying.
So this is an interesting one. ESET put out a pretty neat write-up of some Monero mining software that they had found. Now, Monero is an alternate cryptocurrency. It has some key differences from Bitcoin in that it's harder to track transactions and it's easier to mine. With Bitcoin, the ledger is open to everybody and you can see, this address sent this much money to this address at this time. And everyone agrees to it, because that's basically how the blockchain works. Within Monero, they make it harder to track that. The paper trail of where that money actually came from is a lot harder for anyone to investigate. The second thing is that it's using a different hashing algorithm called Kryptonite, which is actually more favorable to CPUs and GPUs, which commodity boxes tend to have, as opposed to like the specialized mining hardware that the hardcore Bitcoin guys will go out and buy. So it means that if you can get on somebody else's generic box, you could probably use it to mine Monero effectively. So that's why it's attractive. In this case, there was a bug that came out earlier this year in WebDAV, which is part of IIS, and turns out that you could use this to put malware onto a machine that was exposed to the internet and running a vulnerable version of WebDAV. So specifically, you send a prop find message to it that WebDAV supports, and there's like an overflow within that allows you to install your own stuff. So they're pushing a modified version of one of the open source Monero miner tools called XMRig. So basically, they're taking the legit mining one that you would install if you were interested in mining Monero on your own. They made some small modifications to pre-package a bunch of flags in the command line configuration stuff, and the pool they want to send the mining information to, and they package the whole thing and send it over. And it just starts mining on that box.
Right.
It's pretty interesting. They say that this campaign over the last couple of months has mined in American dollars about 63,000 American dollars. And that's with fluctuations in how much Monero has been worth. It's been up to like 150 US, down to like 100 recently. But it's pretty neat to see that this is going on. Apparently they didn't remember to put any persistence into the malware, because they just repackage an existing thing. So, but it doesn't persist. So like over time, as servers get rebooted or something happens to that process, it's just been dwindling. But they've said they've been watching it for a couple of months, and it's a pretty interesting write-up overall. I mean, I think Monero is one we've seen for a while. There was that one malware that we saw a while back that was like going on other machines as photo.scr. Do you remember that one? Yeah, people were pushing it over FTP to servers and running it there, you know. So Monero's been around from a cybercrime perspective for at least a couple of years, but I think now we're seeing more interest in it because of the huge uptick in the value of these cryptocurrencies. So it's something neat to track. It's this whole opportunistic, how can I get other people's machines to perform the heavy, expensive calculations for me? And I think we're going to continue to see more creative ways of finding other people's processors to use for this kind of thing.
Yeah, the trend is shifting toward the other cryptocurrencies. So Monero has been very popular, as you said. There are others. There's a surprising number of cryptocurrencies actually that have really jumped in valuation. But you know, we've really seen the whole Bitcoin thing kind of tail off just because that it's so much harder to generate an actual profit. The profit margins are better with these other cryptocurrencies because they haven't been mined so heavily.
Yep.
So that's, you know, also contributing to that.
I mean, it seems like it's a relatively low effort group because of all the modifications to this are fairly minor. I mean, all they're doing is basically finding a way to package in those configuration things that they know far in advance, so that all it does is it connects directly to the pool that they want it to. I've been kind of interested in Monero and tracking it because of this and newer interest in cryptocurrency among criminals. And it does seem a little bit harder to do, but the mining pools actually, I hadn't thought about using those as a way of tracking it because the pools report and say, okay, this is how much we've been generating over time. But I think an individual address, I think is harder to look at. But it's something that's definitely caught my interest, and I'll see if I can't do a little more research on it the next few weeks.
Okay. So clearly a way to try to protect at least against this particular vector of getting it installed is to make sure that your web dev is
patched. And there is a patch out for it. In fact, Microsoft released this patch sort of, not out of band, but for versions of the Windows servers that they've offered that they have stopped officially supporting because it was a critical bug, which is a good thing to know.
Yeah.
So if you are running any version of Microsoft Windows Server, it behooves you to go out and look for a patch, even if you don't expect to see one.
First and foremost, always be patching your servers. So in this particular case, we've seen that it was a vulnerability that came out a while ago. If your server's not patched against that, you're vulnerable to this.
So we got the internet weather for this week. Most probe ports is the top 10. Again, 23 and 22 are at the top. 1433 is in third place. Apparently they were switched in position last week. AT/TCP is still at number 4. Let's take a look at the number of sources probing. 23 TCP is actually still in the top, and might actually be a little larger than I'm used to. The lion's share of the sources probing. 4 to 45 is in second. Unsurprisingly, this is WannaCry. Probably it's a worm, and there's plenty of other folks who are interested in this vulnerability. The Eternal Blue, Eternal Romance family. So I would expect that to be there for a while. And third is 80 ICMP. I actually put a little guide this weekend because I can never remember which one is which. Type 8 code 0, I think it is echo request, which is like a ping request. 00 ICMP is in 8th, no change from last week, and that's echo reply. So in the top 10, we've got both ping outbound and then ping responses, which is kind of interesting. And then 11.0 ICMP is time exceeded. TTL expired in transit. And you got a lot of this when you're doing traceroute, because you've got a lot of, you keep incrementing that TTL and, things come back as a response to that. So it may suggest that some people out there are doing some massive network recon just to see what hosts are responding to ping. For what reason, I really couldn't say. In the last month or so, there's been an uptick in scanning here on port 23 in a range of about 30,000 scan sources per hour. So it might mean that there's a new botnet in town looking to scan for this as well, or maybe a new population of scanners, same botnet. 1433 is MS SQL, and that's been slowly trending upwards for a while now, actually. Ever since it started to break into the top 10, it's really sort of been creeping up. And that's the number of scan flows here. You can see it comes out around 280, maybe peaks out around 290,000 scan flows per hour. Scan sources on 5358, this is that WSD API we've reported over and over, probably related to Hajime. And that really peaked somewhere in the middle to the end of August. And slowly it's been creeping off. The last time I was on the show, it was around here. And now it's even zeroed off further. We're coming down to about 2,000 scan sources per hour. So it's really not a port of interest anymore, although there's some population out there that is scanning for it. Port 445, I took a 365-day view just to show, again, that this thing continues its march upward. In the 30-day view, it really doesn't show how much this is changing, but you can see a clear trend heading up that way. So,
yeah,
I mean, this is a bug that's been out since like middle of the year.
Right.
And I guess there's so many Windows boxes out there that have not been patched for Eternal Blue and its cousins.
And we keep showing this, I think, same chart week after week, and this does not show any sign of changing directions or even leveling off, for that matter. Every week it seems like the graph just needs to change to fit the new traffic that we're seeing. But it is amazing that it's still climbing.
It kind of bothers me that this port is still out there, especially after the years and years of configure scanning that we were reporting on the show. How many years ago? 7 years ago.
Yep.
But yeah, people are still putting this on the internet. This is an interesting one that hit as sort of an anomaly. It's not in the top 10. I don't think it's even in the top 20, but it showed up in ours as a sort of anomaly.
Okay.
And this is port 17472, which, among other things, is the control port for Tanium. Tanium is for orchestration of security response. It's definitely something that runs with a lot of privileges on your machine because it has to do things similar to what an antivirus might do, except instead of scanning for stuff, it has the rights to do anything an admin might do on the machine to recover from a security situation. Remove software, uninstall services, change files, delete things. Usually you see it on the inside of a corporate network.
Right.
And maybe somebody is looking for boxes that is running the client for this and trying to speak to them. Because this is a powerful tool. If it really is what they're looking for, then if you're able to compromise a box running Tanium, you got kind of almost admin rights on the box.
Right.
Am I right?
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the product does have the ability to manage the asset when it's off network.
interesting.
So that may be what we're seeing here. It's interesting to see such a spike, though.
Yeah.
Like why the huge spike? This is what I would expect to see, sort of, fluctuations in, machines being off network, and then
And less than less than 1 million scan flows per hour here for
Right.
any one of them, and then all of a sudden we're up in 9 million.
right.
That's really something.
That's very interesting.
And that's that. I think the common theme with all the stories is situational awareness. These are all things that people can fix, and if they just know a little bit about security, they can take this into their own hands and fix it. They can patch their machines, they can make sure that they're locking their devices properly, and they can do a little research to understand the full scope of what's necessary in a breach situation so they can be prepared for it later.